Frank was a truck driver delivering beef, and to make extra money for his family, he would steal 2 beef legs every trip. Over the course of a year, he stole a total of 500. Whenever his boss told him to seal the truck with a strip, Frank would pretend to do it properly but secretly hide the seal in his sleeve. On the way, he'd sell the 2 stolen legs cheaply to the mob, then pull the seal back out of his sleeve and seal the truck for real. After delivering the rest of the beef to the actual buyer, he'd give the warehouse manager a small cut so they'd alter the paperwork. No one ever noticed. But Frank's appetite grew, and one day when he opened the truck, it was completely empty. This act enraged the company, and they took him straight to court. Luckily, the mob stood by him, hired a lawyer, and painted him as a struggling working man. Shockingly, it worked, and Frank walked away free. That night, to thank the lawyer, he took him to a bar. Through the lawyer, he met Russell, the head of the Italian Mafia. Russell was involved in every kind of business and had connections with the elite. If you wanted to bribe a judge, ask Russell. If you wanted to promote an underling, ask Russell. If you wanted someone to disappear, you still had to get Russell's approval. He was like a godfather figure. During their talk, Russell was surprised to learn Frank could speak Italian. Frank had served in World War II, fighting Germans in Russell's hometown in Italy. Once, he made 2 prisoners dig their own graves before shooting them. His ruthless efficiency quickly won Russell's favor and changed Frank's life. Frank went from truck driver to mob enforcer, collecting debts and roughing people up, though his family knew nothing about it. One day, he came home to learn his daughter had knocked over some goods in a grocery store and was scolded by the owner. Furious, he grabbed her and stormed to the store, beating the owner badly and even breaking his fingers in front of her. Instead of feeling safer, his daughter grew fearful and distant. Soon after, Frank's 3rd daughter was born, and Russell came with his wife to be the godparents. Influential figures from both sides of the law attended, making Frank feel proud. But with another child came more expenses, so he took on a dangerous side job for a man called Whisper, who offered $10,000 to blow up a rival laundry business. Frank didn't know it was a trap. He scouted the place carefully, then showed up late at night with gasoline and explosives. Just as he was about to act, men sent by Russell stopped him and took him to meet him. Sitting beside Russell was Angelo, the laundry's owner and the Philly mob boss. If Russell hadn't intervened, Frank would already be dead. To repay their mercy, Frank asked for a chance to make it right. He went straight to Whisper, shot him, and tossed the gun into the river. From then on, that river became his dumping ground. Every time he killed, he got rid of the weapon there, until the pile could have armed a small army. Frank never failed a hit, earning Russell's complete trust. Russell introduced him to powerful figures and even to an elegant waitress, which led to Frank leaving his first wife and marrying her. The 2 families grew close, often holding gatherings together. But Frank's daughter Peggy always feared Russell, believing her father's frequent appearances in the papers had everything to do with him. Over time, Frank's loyalty and skill made Russell value him even more. He decided to place Frank with an important figure, Jimmy, president of the Teamsters Union. In the 1950s and 60s, Jimmy's influence in America was second only to the president. At his peak, he had over 2 million registered members and controlled unimaginable assets. He could sway elections and change corporate or government laws. The mob had deep ties to Jimmy. His most effective way of fighting for workers was organizing strikes. Jimmy had a heroic public image, but in truth, he controlled the Teamsters' $8 billion pension fund, a prize many wanted. Projects denied bank loans often came to his union, and the biggest borrowers were mob-run casinos. Las Vegas itself was built this way. Jimmy provided funding for the mob, and in return, they helped secure his power in the union. Russell's reason for placing Frank there was to infiltrate the union with mob influence. Frank delivered right away. His first job was using his knowledge of explosives to eliminate Jimmy's rivals in the taxi union. Jimmy adored him for it, and they became close friends. Their families grew so close that Frank's daughter felt proud to know Jimmy. To working-class people, Jimmy was a hero who fought for union benefits. She wore his badge at school and boasted about what he had done for millions of truckers. Time quickly moved to 1960 when Kennedy was elected president. During his campaign, Russell had used votes from dead mob members to give Kennedy a boost, showing both the mob's reach and Russell's influence. But this time, Jimmy made a huge mistake. In backing a candidate, he chose the wrong side, supporting Nixon and even putting up $500,000 for his campaign team. So once Kennedy took office, his first move was to make his brother Robert attorney general and start a full investigation into Jimmy's Teamsters union. The only goal during this time was to bring down the union and put Jimmy behind bars. Jimmy, already at his wit's end and running into obstacles everywhere, could only vent his frustration on his men in the office. He and Russell were now in conflict over their interests, but Frank was still moving between the two, serving both sides. Sometimes Jimmy, losing his temper, would lash out at Frank, making him want to walk away. Seeing this, the once high and mighty Jimmy actually lowered himself, speaking softly to ask Frank for forgiveness. To rally support, Jimmy decided to hold a nationwide union speech. That night, Frank prepared his gun to accompany him, and the scene was caught by his just just-awakened daughter, who now saw her father as a dangerously violent man. To secure his position, Jimmy promoted a timid, indecisive man to be his number 2 and delivered a fiery speech, winning back many followers. But soon, a new rival appeared. Shorty, president of the 560 local, who was also a New Jersey mob boss. His growing power threatened Jimmy's position, so Jimmy elevated Frank, turning him from a mob hitman into a polished union president. This gave Jimmy the space to focus on the investigation, and he began bribing jurors and judges. Just when he thought victory was in sight, Kennedy was assassinated and Robert left the Attorney General's office. It should have been good news, but Jimmy's bribery of the jury was suddenly exposed, and he was quickly convicted of obstruction of justice. Not long after, the shocking news of President Kennedy's assassination broke, giving Jimmy a brief moment of satisfaction. But his joy didn't last. He was sentenced to 5 years for jury tampering. Even in prison, Jimmy kept control of the union, giving orders to his number 2 to loan money to the mob. But his second-in-command was incompetent and easily intimidated, so whenever the mob asked for money, he complied without question. Frank, though now a local union president, was still Russell's hitman, so the mob always got the loans they wanted. This meant the union had slipped from Jimmy's control, though he had no idea. Outside, new power players were rising in the mob, and Crazy Joey was one of them. At a massive public gathering, he openly plotted a shooting. He was arrogant, disrespectful, even teasing Russell by pulling at the badge on his chest and saying, "What's this? You believe in this crap?" The underworld was no longer what it used to be, but Russell's dignity couldn't be mocked. Frank picked out 2 reliable pistols, went to Joey's family party at a restaurant, calmly walked into position, drew his gun, and fired. Joey bolted for the door, and Frank followed with a fatal shot before driving away and disposing of the weapons at the river as usual. The next day, the restaurant killing was on TV, but Frank, used to it, ate breakfast under the heavy gaze of his daughter. 4 years later, Nixon became president, and because Jimmy had once donated $500,000 to his re-election committee, he was granted a pardon. On the day of his release, he publicly declared to the press that he would take back the union presidency. What he didn't know was that his weak second-in-command was favored by the mob, who wanted to keep him as their puppet. Jimmy's only chance to regain power was to swallow his pride and seek Shorty's support. Frank arranged a meeting, and Shorty agreed, but deliberately arrived 15 minutes late. Once, Jimmy would never wait more than 10 minutes for anyone, but now, desperate, he had to play humble. Frank tried hard to mediate, but the tension between the two grew. What was meant to turn enemies into allies ended up as a hostile standoff. In anger, Jimmy asked Frank to get rid of his number 2, but Frank knew Russell's mob would never allow it. Jimmy finally realized there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests, and began using the media to expose mob union ties. This struck at the heart of Russell's business. Russell wanted Jimmy to retire quietly, but Jimmy refused. Frank, caught in the middle, delivered the message, but Jimmy stayed defiant. Soon after, the union held a ceremony honoring Frank, attended by politicians and businessmen who all saw Jimmy as a threat. Jimmy didn't care, as he considered Frank a close friend, and Frank saw him as a mentor. Such an important award had to be presented by Jimmy himself. It was the peak of Frank's career, and Jimmy gave him a watch as a token of their bond. The banquet looked peaceful, but behind the scenes, tension ran high. Jimmy, though not holding office, had ordered old allies to control part of the mob's loan business. Russell and his inner circle seemed to be plotting something. Frank knew they might make a move on Jimmy, and to draw Frank closer, Russell offered him a ring symbolizing the mob's highest power, one of only 3 in existence. He told Frank seriously that Jimmy had to step down. This was the mob's final warning. With his best friend under threat, Frank was torn. He hoped Jimmy would walk away from the fight, but Jimmy wouldn't compromise. He believed he had evidence that could scare the mob, and to him, the Teamsters were everything, something he would never give up. A few days later, Russell asked Frank to bring his wife and accompany him to Detroit for a wedding. The wedding was just a cover for a secret plan. Along the way, Frank kept calling Jimmy, trying to convince him to meet and talk things over, but Jimmy refused every time. Not far from Detroit, Russell also made a phone call, sealing Jimmy's fate. When Frank called again, Jimmy unexpectedly agreed to meet, which surprised Frank. He went to ask Russell why and learned that the mob had already decided to take Jimmy out. The so-called meeting was just a trap, and Russell warned Frank not to tip him off. That night, Frank sat by the phone, staring at it, enduring the longest night of his life. The next morning, Frank got new orders. Russell wanted him to do it himself. It wasn't because Russell was being cruel, but because he knew that if anyone else was sent, Frank would try to stop it. Only Frank could see it through. If he refused, his family would pay the price. They drove to a small airport. Frank sat by the window, looking out at the wing circling over the bay, eyes wet, heart aching at the thought of killing the man who had mentored him. When the plane landed, the mob had a car and a gun ready for him. They had planned to meet Jimmy at 2 in the afternoon, but Frank deliberately showed up late, thinking Jimmy's punctual nature would make him leave. He didn't expect Jimmy to still be there at 2:30. 6:30. The driver told Jimmy the meeting location had changed. Jimmy hesitated, sensing something off, but when he saw Frank in the back seat, he let his guard down and got in. The two old friends hugged in the back seat, Jimmy completely unaware that his life was about to end. Near the destination, Jimmy asked Frank if he had a gun, knowing how unpredictable mobsters could be. Once inside the house, Frank pulled out his gun. Jimmy saw the empty room and instantly realized it was a setup. Frank fired several shots, and Jimmy fell to the floor. Frank didn't have time to grieve. He dragged the body aside, set the gun down, and fled. Jimmy died at the hands of the friend he trusted most. Frank flew out of Detroit, where Russell greeted him at the airport, and they continued on to the wedding. Meanwhile, Jimmy's body, wrapped in a rug, was tossed into a crematory and burned. Days later, news of Jimmy's disappearance was on TV. Frank's daughter asked him one last question. Why? Why? But he said nothing. From that day on, she never spoke to him again. He knew she might never forgive him. In the years that followed, no one was ever convicted for Jimmy's murder. But with Jimmy gone, the mob began to fade. Everyone connected to Russell ended up in prison on trumped-up charges. Even Frank, who was jailed for bribery. The once powerful Russell suffered a stroke and was stuck in a wheelchair. Frank, still carrying old war injuries, lived with constant joint pain. Time passed and everyone grew older. Russell couldn't even chew his favorite bread anymore. He began talking about Jimmy often, calling him a good and honest man, regretting that he had put business above loyalty. The once untouchable mob boss started confessing his sins, as if he knew his end was near. Russell soon ended up in the cemetery, and a few months later, Frank was released from prison. By then, his wife had died, leaving him completely alone. His arthritis worsened, and he walked with a cane. When he fell, he could only lie helpless on the floor. He hobbled into the bank where his daughter worked, stood in line, and when his number was called, he tried to talk to her. She ignored him. Frank insisted he had done everything to protect the family, but she told him that when they had problems, they never came to him for protection because they were afraid of what he might do. The life of crime he thought had been for them was never what they wanted. Later, Frank hired a black nurse. With the nurse by his side, he picked out his grave and chose a green coffin, the color of Ireland, the color of home. In his remaining years, the only visitors were federal agents, hoping he'd reveal the truth about Jimmy's disappearance. They told him there was no one left to protect, but Frank stayed silent. Keeping secrets was the code he had lived by. When he heard from them that his lawyer had died, he instinctively asked who did it, only to hear the answer: cancer. The irony was cold and bitter. Frank spent his last days in church. A priest once asked if he felt remorse for the things he'd done. Frank said he didn't. The priest told him that even if he didn't feel it, he could at least say it. Frank thought for a long time, then quietly asked, what kind of man makes a call like that? Maybe what he really wanted to ask was, what kind of man dies for a friend? Was there regret for joining the mob, pity for killing a friend, or disgust for living as nothing but a tool? Christmas was coming. After the priest's prayer, he was eager to go home to his family. Frank asked him to leave the door slightly open, a habit from his life as a hitman. Maybe it was also a sign of hope, that if his daughter came that night, he could see her right away. The final image froze on the old man in the doorway's crack. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this film. Do you think Frank ever truly regretted what he did? Drop your opinions in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next recap.